Good morning. I'm recording this video actually quite early in the morning, so I'm sincere when I say good morning because it is indeed an early morning for me, and nice to have you in class today. This is class number 5 on fabric design. We're moving right along in the course, so let's just get started right away. I'll start by asking you if you did something interesting this week besides working on your weaving cards. I wish you could write in chat and tell me what you did. Hopefully you had fun doing something this week. I actually went skiing this week. I'm recording this in the middle of the winter, and I'm just recovering from a broken ankle. And so I went skiing for the first time, and the conditions aren't great. So I'm going to hang in there a little bit longer and wait for good snow, which is predicted in a couple of weeks. So for class today, you're going to need your swatch book and some sort of a magnifying glass, either on your phone or an actual magnifying glass. So I'll grab mine handy, make sure that I have mine ready while you're grabbing yours and making sure they are close by for this lecture. I will offer an opening prayer this morning. Our Father in heaven, we're grateful to be taking this class together with students that are viewing online. I'm grateful to be able to teach this class on textiles and share a little bit of the knowledge that I have. Please bless me as a teacher that I will be able to share the things that I have learned, and bless the students that watch this video that they will be receptive to the things that I'm teaching. We say this humbly in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So let's look at the progression of our class lectures while we look at this absolutely gorgeous piece of silk that I bought some years ago and haven't yet used. Isn't that beautiful? I just love beautiful, beautiful pieces of fabric. All right, as you remember, we started our first lecture talking about the first two topics on this list: aesthetics or characteristics of fabric, and also sustainability in design. And then we moved on to fibers, both natural and man-made. Then we talked about yarn, the linear material that is actually made into fabric. And fabric structure, how cloth is made. And then today is fabric design, how a fabric looks. So as we discuss fabric design, we're going to focus on the appearance of the fabric, not so much on the structure. But I love the appearance of fabric. I just love playing with it. I love looking at it. Anything that has flowers or botanical prints of any kind, I just absolutely love fabric design. So we're going to look at several of my favorite fabrics today. But first we're going to start by reviewing last week's lecture on fabric structure so that you can use your completed weaving cards. So this screen is set up for my class that I'm teaching via Zoom today. I don't know that there's a way that we can adapt this to the class. I was going to have students that are assigned on here find fabrics in their swatch books, and then have other students analyze those fabrics. But I think we'll just move on to a wonderful video showing some wonderful weaves of silk, linen, and cotton, a clip from the movie The Great Gatsby, which I really enjoyed. So let's watch that just as a nice review of wonderful fabrics. All she could say was, I've never seen such beautiful shirts before. Just a wonderful clip from Great Gatsby. I'm reading the book right now, so I watched the video last week and just loved seeing all of those beautiful, beautiful textiles, all of those silks and cotton from India. He said cotton flannels and linens, just beautiful fabrics. I've never seen such beautiful shirts before. All right, week number 5, fabric design. So we already have a knowledge of the basic properties of fibers, right? Natural and man-made. Let's refer back to our chart that we've looked at so often. We've talked about yarns, the linear material that is made into a fabric, and structures, how cloth is made, how it's woven or it is knit. And this helps designers and end users understand what makes a fabric look the way it does or perform in a special way. So hopefully you understand that there's this natural progression in this class, that we've kind of broken the textiles down into the fibers, the yarns, the weaving, and the knitting process. And now we get to look at fabric design, how these beautiful fabrics end up, and we kind of understand the characteristics that have gone into the fabrics at this point. So that will be our discussion of today's lecture. You watched 4 videos this week. The first one was on Liberty of London, a wonderful textile company in England, and I'm showing you here on the right some of my Liberty of London fabrics that I bought when I visited their retail store in London in 2015. And actually I'm going to go there again in May of this year. I'm so excited. But they are known for their fabulous cottons. They're very, very lightweight. It's an iconic company, somewhat like Laura Ashley. They're both known as, both Laura Ashley and Liberty of London are known as dressmaker fabrics, but they've both also moved into upholstery. I actually made Christmas stockings out of some of my Liberty of London fabrics, but I couldn't find them to photograph them for you for this slide. But they are just fabulous cottons, and now they've moved into the silks. And I think you noticed in the video 2 of the designers that talked to us were actually wearing Liberty of London prints. It's just kind of nice. The second video, the cravat collection, he talked about trying to uplift and add mood to enhance the mood in his rooms with his fabrics. And he showed some e-cots. They were mentioned twice, and it's interesting that e-cots come up in this lecture 3 times. So I just want you to understand what an e-cot is. It's a particular weave, just like this, and you'll begin to recognize e-cots in time from seeing them in the videos, and we'll talk about them later on in the class. So he showed the e-cot fabrics a couple of times. The third video, Collier Campbell Archive, taught us how fabric designers love painting. Susan and Sarah in this video showed us scarves, linens, textiles, and e-cot fabric again. So they talked about the concept of repeat, which we learned about a few weeks ago, or actually last week we learned about the concept of repeat, and that was mentioned in this video. And they said that fabric designers absolutely love painting. Not all fabric designers do, but some fabric designers do. And then the last one was Fiona Howard, a textile designer. She travels from Venice, California to London. She prints completely by hand, the old-fashioned way. She draws the designs. And when I first watched this video, it occurred to me that when I was in grad school, I was envious of those who were designing fabric, because there were classes that were offered on making your own prints, actually painting and transferring those painted designs onto fabric. I was jealous, but I can't draw and I don't like to paint, so it's certainly not for me. But it might be a nice career path for some of you. Here in the state of Utah, excuse me, where I'm actually teaching from this morning, there are many fabric designers in the quilt world that have become very, very famous just by designing their own fabric. So it's just a career path, excuse me, to consider. Some of you might enjoy that more so than being an interior designer, just something to consider. So let's we're going to be talking about different types of fabric designs, and so you don't need to necessarily memorize the vocabulary that I'm going to give you, but we need to understand some basic concepts. So again, fabric design that we're talking about today is how a fabric looks. We're going to talk about motifs, design style, and the layout, which are all introduced on this slide. So we can see motifs in the upper right corner motifs are the subject matter that are actually depicted on the fabric, and that can range from stripes to fabrics. In motifs on fabric, florals are certainly the most common and certainly my favorite, but motifs would also could also be natural forms such as animals, shells, juvenile patterns, geometric and abstract, contemporary and transitional fabrics. All kinds of things fall into this category. of motifs. So I'm just introducing the three categories that we're going to be discussing as part of fabric design. The second element would be design style types. And that's the way the motifs are actually rendered, including their geographical or historical origin and general appearance. And that sometimes includes how they are made. So some of the design style types that we will talk about today are Japanese, African, fabrics that are based on the Georgian era, Art Deco fabrics, those from the Italian Renaissance or the Elizabethan periods. So those different design style types often come from a historic origin. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth. We'll also discuss layout, which is the actual arrangement of the motifs. How are they spaced on the fabric? Are they packed together? Are they tossed about? Do the motifs kind of meander? Or do they play upon the tree of life or bouquet? Are they set or tailored? And as part of layout, we'll talk about directional fabrics and specific layouts. So that's kind of an introduction of where we're heading. So here are our three categories: motifs, or the subject matter; the design style types, which is the historic origin; and layout, which are how the motifs are arranged. So let's start with motifs on the next slide. It's so similar to this flip-flop quilt in the previous image, though the two really have nothing to do with each other. Like I said, but the little motifs on these flip-flops on the quilt are all little conversation quilts. I mentioned before a cat quilt on the left. I needed an airplane motif, an airplane type fabric for a grandson's birthday party, and this shows a mask that I made for all of the guests at the birthday party. So I needed this airplane motif. It was easy to find. You can find pretty much anything converted into a motif. And isn't that grandbaby adorable with cake all over his face? It was his first birthday, but he's now over 2. Some of the masks that I made using different motifs, the cotton Halloween fabric and the silk masks, wow, that's really quite out of focus, are all made out of, the Christmas masks are all made out of silk. Like I said, most any motif can be found. So here are some more types of fabric designs, motifs, some more florals. As I mentioned, they have been the most common and best-selling motif for several hundred years. And florals will also often show the structural way that the flowers grow, when we refer to those as botanical prints. They'll often show the complex organic shapes that go into making these flowers, and the surprising color combinations that naturally occur keep these floral motifs from being monotonous. These floral motifs rarely have negative connotations of any kind. And regardless of the trends of the time or trends that are in style in any given time, some interpretation of plant forms, abstract, stylized, or realistic, will always be prevalent. They just have never really gone out of style. We won't talk about chintz on this slide. We'll just enjoy some of the beautiful textiles that we can see. This is a chair, continuing with florals. This is an antique family heirloom that I recently had upholstered in a floral motif. Now, we talked about repeat, so in this one it was real important to me that image of the flower was just right in the center of the chair, so I had to be very, very clear with the upholsterer that is where I wanted the repeat, and I had to buy enough fabric to allow for that. This is a beautiful print of poppies that I have in our home in Newport Beach. And looking at this slide, it looks a little bit overwhelming, the poppies against that very, very busy wallpaper in a small powder room. But it's actually the only room in the house that is wallpapered. It was inspired by a Japanese poppy, a painting that I just love. And in the state of California, poppy is actually the state flower. So I just love these botanical images, and I copied the idea from this poppy print that's in the living room and used a very busy floral print in the bathroom. A lot of fun, just a fun thing done with wallpaper that could also be done with textiles. And we love this print so much that you can see that it's kind of a highlight in our home. And I often photograph people in front of the print. You can see our 4 grown kids on the right there, with my oldest son on the left being very, very goofy. That's not how his face normally looks. But a floral design that we really, really enjoy in our family. So often pictures get taken in front of it. Florals are so popular. As I mentioned, botanical prints, where the entire plant form, including the roots, are rendered as if the viewer were seeing each part of the plant, the form of the plant at eye level. I just love botanical prints. And as much as I love botanical prints, I really don't like tropical prints, which are shown on the right, but I know they're very popular. And the motifs and the color features give us a feel for what the tropics look like and kind of take us to the tropics. The layouts are usually quite bold and bright and colorful. And I've actually made pillows out of tropical prints, fabrics that I bought from Hawaii, but I don't think I've ever used them. So I have them in my collection, but they're not really my favorite. My sister-in-law recently asked me to make her some pillows for her newly completed kitchen. She had a built-in bench. And these are some of the fabrics that I chose for her for that particular room. The paisley on the left with some velours, and then the 2 fabrics on the right, which I really liked. But she chose the ones on the left and was able to make her some great pillows of some fun fabrics. So more on motifs and effects. We're still talking about florals, which are the most popular of the motifs. The beautiful fabric on the left, I just love that textile. It's what we call a Jacobean print. It's derived from popular embroidery furnished fabrics of the late Elizabethan and Jacobean eras. So that fabric is printed, but it's made to look like the embroidered designs from previous ages. It's characterized by heavy ornament of German and Flemish origin, and it's usually made up of branches and other arborescent forms, accented by those beautiful floral motifs in kind of a meandering layout that feature leaves growing off of vines, kind of in the way that we would see them in nature, is that Jacobean look of imitating embroidered designs. Paisley is also considered a floral, though it's just kind of a created image. It's a traditional Asian pattern of a teardrop shape that actually originated in India. And I use paisley fabrics a lot. They were originally painted and printed. The fabric was used to make shawls, usually woven cashmere shawls were paisley, and imitations of these shawls were first woven in Paisley, Scotland, and which is where the motif became more elaborately rendered. And so that term paisley from Paisley, Scotland has kind of stuck around as the term that we use to describe this particular motif. We also have our French country prints from Provence, which are small-scale floral patterns that originated during the 18th century in Provence. These were originally woodblock patterns, meaning that they were printed with a block of wood that had the fabric design carved into it. The designs are regularly spaced and usually printed, but can be woven onto the fabric. So my next slide is going to show kind of my adaptations of these, where I have, we talked about fabric that imitate an embroidery. And we talked about paisleys. I wouldn't necessarily call them florals, but all the textbooks show them as florals. And we talked about paisley shawls, and these paisley fabrics are most often from bright primary colors. So the Jacobean print that we looked at in the previous slide copies embroidered textiles, and I might have shown you this one already. It's one of my embroidered textiles from Central Asia, silk on silk. So this one's actually embroidered, but some of our Jacobean motifs imitate this look of copying these embroidered textiles from an earlier age. And as I mentioned, I use paisley all the time. These slides show a couple of different pillows that I have made out of paisley fabrics, and then we talked about fabrics from Provence. These Provençal fabrics were actually purchased, the ones on the far right were actually purchased in the south of France. We talked about Provence fabrics being these small motifs, like the ones on the back of the pillow. And they're combined, these are put together with some embroidery that I actually did on a cruise on the Greek islands, which makes me long for lots of travel that I did during the pre-COVID days. So examples of what a Jacobean print might look like if it's imitating an embroidered fabric, some paisley fabrics, some fabrics from Provence, all different types of motifs. And here, this is an embroidered pillow that I made out of an embroidered print or embroidered screen that my mother made some years ago that was actually in a frame, and I took it out and made it into a pillow. Just threw that in to show you how much I love florals, even though that's not a fabric, it's an embroidered design. But there are fabrics that imitate embroidered designs. So more motifs. We sometimes see animal prints, such as these little frogs and salamanders on the left. Animal skins are often reproduced in textiles. We'll see that in the next slide. We can have shells, stones, waves, landscapes, are all traditionally popular textile motifs. So motifs, just of every variety. In the right are what we call figurative motifs. They're composed of pictures of recognizable objects that are kind of just all thrown in together. It doesn't really matter what the scale is. We also have juvenile figurative patterns that are designed specifically for children's products. And I think I meant to throw in there's a space there on the slide. I think I meant to throw in some juvenile designs there, but haven't done that yet. I did mention animal prints as being very, very popular. I mean, what's not to love about animal prints? And these are just a few that I have in my closet. And interestingly enough, my husband absolutely hates them. So I own them, but I don't actually wear them too often. And you wouldn't necessarily see them in a formal office setting in an upholstery fabric, but if we used animal prints, might be nice in a bedroom, in a home perhaps. So they're not for everyone, but think of animal prints in terms of a particular motif that could be interpreted into upholstery fabrics. So more on motifs. Other natural forms that we have on the left, what's called chinoiserie. It's any Western interpretation of Oriental design, and those became popular in the 18th century. So many of our toiles, which we see on the right, are based on chinoiserie, which is kind of this Asian or Oriental interpretation that became very popular in the 18th century. These are going to contain architectural elements that are Chinese, perhaps Chinese vases or ornaments, and stereotypical Chinese plant forms such as bamboo. Another popular motif that we see on the right is called toile de Jouy, and these are very popular textiles from the mid-1700s from the city of Jouy, France. And they're usually printed in one color on just a natural background, and they have pastoral or figurative pictures as motifs in simple repeats, so landscapes that are repeated over and over again. And as I mentioned, they commonly include just one color florals with vine traverse layouts with large exposed areas of natural ground cloth. I had a student in a previous class that loved toile de Jouy. I love it as well. And she designed her whole wedding around toile de Jouy fabrics, had a bridesmaid dresses out of toile de Jouy that were quite lovely. And she also showed how her family uses the toile de Jouy textiles a lot in their home. They even have Christmas ornaments and Christmas decorations that are out of toile de Jouy fabric. So speaking of I don't know that I mentioned, these are from Jouy, France. So speaking of French influence, chinoiserie. And this scarf from my collection illustrates the Chinese chinoiserie. It's kind of multi-directional, but has those vases and those vines that we talked about as representing chinoiserie. And a few more toile de Jouy fabrics that were produced, as I mentioned, in France, 1750 to the 1800s, that are still very much in use today. As I mentioned, that it's usually just printed in one color. It can be kind of a pastoral scene, which we see in both of these, just one color based on a background with these floral motifs just kind of printed over and again in one color on a solid background, a neutral background. And it looks like we've got a video here which does not translate into this format, so we will skip that for now. But it showed how the toile de Juillet fabrics are made. So, speaking of French fabrics, now let's move on to Versailles, the Palace of Versailles in Versailles, France. I went there in about, 2014, 2015. I had just finished my grad program where I had studied fabrics from the Baroque and Regency periods of Louis XIV, the Rococo period of Louis XV, the early neoclassical fabrics of Louis XVI, and the late neoclassical fabrics of the Napoleon Empire. And all of these early French kings, Louis XIV up through Napoleon, all lived in Versailles at one point. So when I went to Versailles, excuse me, I took my notes on French textiles and just several images, a lot more than I'm showing you here, from those periods of Louis XIII through the Louis XVI, Louis XIV through Louis XVI, as well as Napoleon, to see if the textiles that I had studied from this era were properly in use in the Versailles Castle. So I wanted to see if the textiles in all of the rooms of the palace matched what I had studied, and they did. That was very exciting to see textiles which are very specific from different eras shown in such a wonderful venue as the Versailles Palace. And actually, speaking of Versailles, there's a new film that my husband and I saw last week. It's a fairy tale about Versailles called The King's Daughter. So that is new in this year, that when I'm recording this video, which is January 2020. It's now February 2022. So when you watch this video, this might be an old movie. But if you get a chance, see The King's Daughter. It's a fairy tale about Versailles, and you can get a little bit of a peek at the wallpapers and the window treatments and the bed coverings of these marvelous textiles that are in that castle, or palace really, from those early French years that we discussed, Palace of Versailles. So more about motifs, geometric, abstracts, and vermicelli. So geometric motifs come from geometric shapes. They're the most common design after florals. So we have abstracts on the bottom, which take those geometrics and soften them just a little bit. And then we have vermicelli up on the right. And it's a term that I have never, ever used. I mean, I just don't know. Vermicelli sounds like it's more of a pasta or a small rodent. So it's nothing that I'm familiar with. We discussed Dobby prints last week, which are very, very small prints that would be considered motifs. We also have contemporary and transitional motifs. Contemporary is a term used to classify designs with simple, extremely stylized motifs, as you see on the left. This shows kind of calligraphy, calligraphic brushstrokes are a typical contemporary motif, as are simple abstract and geometric figures. And then the image on the right would be called a transitional motif. It sits comfortably between the realistic and the completely non-figurative. It's a catch-all term for patterns that don't represent any particular style and can be used in any setting, would be called transitional motifs. So I organize my fabrics in particular ways. Generally, I organize them by type of motif. You'll find that sample books that you'll eventually have in your collection, you're going to have to decide how you're going to organize them. So you can see how I organize some of my fabrics by motifs on shelves in my room. I have all of the boxes labeled to tell what kind of fabrics are in them. Some of them are designed by fabric type. You see the ones in the top left. I have wool, linen, silk that are in those boxes, and then others, other fabrics that I have in boxes represent motifs that, reproduction fabrics that represent the motifs of different periods, such as 1825, 1830s, 1840s. I have to have fabrics from those different eras for the textiles that I design for the church. So I organize them in that way. And you also see I have a fabric chart from Kona Cotton that shows all of these wonderful, wonderful fabrics. I keep that close by with my fabrics. I also have samples of different white fabrics. Sometimes I'll need to go to a meeting over the church history library and I'll need to reproduce a quilt. So as I'm looking at the quilt, I want to know exactly what white it is so I can compare it to these 15 or so different white fabrics that I keep handy so I could actually match a particular fabric. I mean, there are many, many, many whites, as you can imagine when you start studying particular fabrics. So we've talked about all the different kinds of motifs in fabric design, which is our subject for today, how fabric actually looks. I think now we'll move on to the next aspect of this, the design style types or the historic origin of fabric design, which is another element of fabric design. We've discussed a wide variety of motifs, prints, stripes, dots, etc. So historic origin refers more to how they're made or where the or a particular locale or location that is represented in the fabric. So let's move forward in discussing historic origin, which is our second element of fabric design. So we have looked at many motifs, we've looked at conversation prints, blah, 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 I already mentioned that, but now we're moving on to design style types. So many cultures around the world contribute motifs, patterns, and techniques that become popular in various styles of design. So here we have on the left some Japanese influenced fabrics, some Georgian era in the center, and then some Art Deco that actually comes out of the United States. On the bottom, we have Italian Renaissance. We have Elizabethan. So all types of design styles that show the historic origin. We've mentioned the ikat fabric a couple of times, and this is one that came out of Japan, like the one that I'm holding. You can see that ikat design where the pattern is actually woven with threads in different colors. Also out of Japan, we have shibori, kasuri, just different elements of fabric design that represent different countries. So there are some that mention, as I mentioned, this one in particular represents Japan. Many design styles, we get inspiration from different cultures. When I travel, I like to buy textiles from different countries. This is one that I bought in Africa. It's actually a beautiful embroidered panel that represents some of the elements that one might see in Africa. So this is an African design style type. Also out of Africa, we have kente cloth, batiks, and embroidered ones. Like I mentioned, this is one that I have hanging on a bathroom wall now. These can be used as upholstery or as art, but they represent different countries. So that's their design style. Also, here is one that I bought in Guatemala. It's called huipil. And if you've studied, if you've been in Guatemala or served a mission there, you'll notice I'm probably pronouncing huipil incorrectly. This is one that I commissioned in a village in northern Guatemala. And it actually is hanging from the ceiling of my sewing room here in Salt Lake City. So wonderful. So many wonderful things can be done with textiles that have historic origins. I showed you this image earlier when we talked about repeat, telling you that batik fabrics don't have a repeat. But they come, this is an Indonesian batik, but they are also made in India, China, and Africa. Just wonderful, wonderful design styles that have a historic origin from countries such as India, China, Africa, Indonesia. So design styles of historic origin. So we'll now move on to the last section of fabric design, how a fabric looks. And that category is layout, how the motifs are arranged on the fabric would be the actual layout. So we have this slide shows different layouts, how motifs are arranged on fabric. The upper left one shows that they are spaced. There is background or ground between the motifs, so that's kind of a space layout. The bottom image, we saw that already, but we would call that a packed layout where the motifs overlap and touch each other. And then we have kind of a tossed motif or arrange or layout on the upper right where the motifs are somewhat randomly arranged as we see in those flip-flops. It's just kind of a random arrangement, as though those were just thrown out there. We also have a meander layout, which is kind of an all-over layout that has more of a balanced look. Motifs are regularly occur within the repeat unit. So the motifs are connected in some way, forming a network that somehow covers the entire design plane. So that would be a meandering motif on these beautiful fabrics. Moving on to more layouts. The left one indicates a tree of life layout, and when you look at that, perhaps you're thinking tapestry again. We talked about tapestries earlier on, and this is a fabric that imitates a tapestry. Well, it's also imitating a design feature which is called a tree of life, which is a very traditional design. We'll see some more of those in another slide in a few minutes, but that is what we call a tree of life design element, where the design features are elaborate. They're kind of embellished, floral-like, where they seem to grow and wander across the entire design plane. We have a bouquet layout on the upper right, where flowers or plants are arranged with identical or varying bouquets that repeat at regular intervals. And there's that term again. We have a repeat. It's also called a 5-point when a fabric covers a sofa cushion, where we have one bouquet in the center and then part of a bouquet that shows in each of the 4 corners of the cushion. And that's where repeat comes into play. If you were going to buy this bouquet fabric, you would have to decide if it was going to be used on a couch or a chair, you would have to decide what motif you're going to put in the center back of the chair or on the seat cushion of the chair or the couch, and that's where repeat comes into play. And then you have to determine how that is laid out so that all of the cushions match. If it's a couch, it becomes very, very important to understand for repeat and looking at the design and the layout. On the bottom of this slide, we have more of a set or tailored layout where the motifs repeat directly under and across the design plane. So you can see on the sides of the 2 chairs, they've mimicked how the fabric is put on those chairs so it matches exactly. They've paid a close attention to the design. So that's a very, very tailored layout. Now back to these tree of life. It's an all-over layout where these floral-like motifs seem to wander or meander all over the plane with this very, very stylized tree that will sometimes show the roots with all these meandering vines and a border around it. It's a very traditional layout dating back to the Indian palampores. And palampores were hand-painted cotton panels that were imported to Europe in the mid-17th century. They were very, very popular. They've become highly collectible. The DuPont family in, I think it's the state of Delaware, there's a museum called the Winter Tour, and they have an incredible collection of palampores that were traditionally used for bed coverings, and they were at one point banned in France and Britain for most of the 18th century. France and Britain were homes of silk production, and these beautiful cotton palampores were competing for the buyers' dollars. So for a time they were banned in France and Britain. But I can't overstate the importance of these Indian cotton printing techniques, including these palampores, which eventually influenced the printing in France and England and America. These tree of life images. Overall layout would be the type of fabric design. And also that same look of layout where we have kind of an overall floral is shown in these two images. The one on the left is a quilt that I've been working on for some years, actually done in applique, but it's a reproduction of a very, very old textile, but it gives you that look of an overall layout. On the right, I show a couple of embroidered designs that I actually purchased in Hawaii, but they were most likely imported from somewhere else. It's not a Hawaiian look. But they show an all-over layout with the motifs touching. So that's an element of fabric design layout, how the motifs are arranged. And these are an overall layout. This is a bowl. It's a beautiful bowl that I bought in Park City at an art show. But it also shows that overall layout with the motifs touching that we see so often. And wouldn't that be beautiful interpreted into a silk scarf or silk fabric? Just a beautiful overall design. Another type of layout that I mentioned briefly earlier is kind of a tailored look where the motifs repeat themselves across the design plane. This is an entry floor that I designed for our condo here in Salt Lake City based upon a quilt design, and I designed it using granite and marble. So this pattern is very, very tailored. It repeats itself 9 times, and I can't think of the name of the quilt pattern right now. I think it's probably Sister's Choice, I think is the name, the name of this particular one. So just a few more slides on layout as an aspect of fabric design. And I'm wishing I could have interaction with you right now because I'm just lecturing and not talking with you. I'm just talking to you, which I know is not always the best way to teach, but hopefully you're finding it interesting and engaging. So in this concept of layout, we have directional layout. And some of these slides that I use were produced in the department prior to me teaching, and I don't use them more often than I have to because a lot of them are incorrect. For instance, the one on the left, it shows us a one-way motif where all of the motifs face upward. Well, no, in fact, all of those motifs face downward. But it is a one-way layout, so when you're using this fabric, it all has to be used in the same direction because the motifs all face downward in this particular slide. We also have other images that are two-way, where half of the motifs are upright, half of them are upside down, so the pattern can be used in either direction. So we also have a multi-directional layout, which we see on the right, where the motifs face all directions. And again, that one's going to look correct no matter which direction is used. So this is our final slide that illustrates layout. We have a random matched fabric, which we see on the upper right, where the fabric is randomly matched from the seat to the back and the seat to the seat with no particular layout in place. In the chair that you see on the bottom left, you have a fabric that is turned sideways, so it runs horizontally. So the direction of the pattern runs vertically on the furniture. A term that is used in the industry is kind of railroading. We see up the roll is where the fabric is kind of goes up and over the furniture, and then we have a railroading layout where the fabric is used in a horizontal way on the furniture. So again, vertical would be called up the roll, horizontal would be called kind of railroad. So fabric can be used either way. If it's a stable fabric that doesn't have too much stretch in either direction, then it doesn't matter which way it's put on the fabric. So you see both of those concepts, railroading and up the roll, illustrated on this particular slide. So I'm showing you a couple of fabrics that I have laid out for a couple of juvenile quilts that I'm making. So what is the layout of these fabrics? When you look at those, what comes to mind? First, looking at the 2 dots, we see kind of an overall design that's printed evenly would be the layout on that. On the florals in the bottom, they tend to meander across the fabric. They evenly cover the background. So just a quick review of the layout, which is basically how the motifs are arranged on the fabric. So we've talked about 3 types of fabric design. We've looked at some great fabrics and some perhaps not so great fabrics if they don't appeal to you. I'm actually wearing a fabric that I love. It's an all-over meandering floral on silk. Just a great fabric design made into a blouse. So we've discussed motifs, how which are actually the subject matter of the fabric. We've discussed design style types, which often reflect back to the historic origin of the fabric. And then our third category was layout, how the motifs are arranged. So 3 elements of fabric design, which tells us exactly how a fabric looks. So let's bring it all together again at the end of this lecture, going back to the previous 4 weeks leading up to fabric design today, as we look at this beautiful image of many fabrics arranged by color with like kinds of fabrics grouped together. And as you look at this image, you can actually see the weaves that we've talked about in the ones on the top. And then you have these wool flannels on the bottom that have been flocked, which is a term I believe that we talked about. So a lot of the elements that we have learned about textiles all show up in this one slide. So looking back, what do we know? We start with natural and or man-made fibers have to be gathered, and then they are spun into yarn or made into filament. So we have yarns or filaments, which is our second step, out of those fibers. And then those yarns or filaments are laboriously combined into just the right amount, the right combination of ply and twist. That's our yarn phase. And then those yarns are meticulously woven into yards and yards of gorgeous fabric. And that fabric can take on literally an endless amount of fabric designs. So that's our progression so far in this class, starting with our fibers that are made into fabrics and that have all of these gorgeous designs woven into them or printed on them. All right, so let's look at our assignments. This is a rather short class today, less than an hour. So what do we have for next week? We have a fabric notebook assignment, part 4. We're going to talk about finishes and backing, and that will be the second half of our class next week. You're going to watch 2 videos on preparedness, and please make sure that you watch those and you report on those prior to the beginning of next week's class. And then also the first part of class, we're going to talk about your own design style. And you did not see this in the syllabus. Actually, I just added this little assignment in the syllabus. It's not going to be graded, but I want you to, by Monday, I want you to email me an image of something that indicates your design style. So something from your room, a picture that you like, a shelf with objects on it, a piece of fabric that's interesting to you, or one piece of furniture, something that's going to indicate your personal design style. As I mentioned at the beginning of the class, and I'll continue to mention, becoming an interior designer requires practicing all of these techniques with your own objects and as you are developing your own style. And as you develop your own style and recognize what's in your own style of design, then that helps you recognize elements in your client's particular style. So, okay, you've got to do a notebook assignment, add finishes and backings to your swatch book. You've got to watch 2 videos, and you need to email me an image of something that indicates your design style. You might want to take a screenshot of this or take a picture of it so you remember to do this added little assignment that is due on Monday. I think that's it for this week. As usual, you can email me with any questions. Have a nice week.